I have kept a tally book for 31 years. Head of cattle, sacks of flour, days without rain, the exact morning my wife stopped breathing, all of it in the same cramped hand, because a man who writes a thing down doesn't have to carry it in his chest. So believe me when I tell you, I know the difference between a number and a life. The winter the Vance sisters came to Bitterwater, I stopped being able to tell them apart. You'll want to know how four grieving men who couldn't say two soft words between them ended up with a house full of women who'd been half broken by the road east to west. You'll want the tidy version, lonely brothers, brave brides, a wedding under the cottonwoods. That isn't the story. The story is a fevered girl on a wagon bed, a brother who was supposed to leave and didn't, a decision made at midnight that should have gone the other way, and the strange arithmetic of how a house learns to breathe again. I wrote all of it down. I'm going to read it to you plain. Stay with me. The part you're bracing for isn't the part that'll get you. That's the first thing I logged. That gray afternoon in November, wagon in 3:40 coming in wrong, because a wagon that's bringing you good news doesn't lurch down the Bitterwater cut with one wheel screaming, and a stranger sawing the reins like he's trying to strangle a snake. Ledger, my mule, put his ears back and wouldn't come off the fence. I've learned to trust that animal's ears more than my own eyes. I was salting hides by the smokehouse and I stood up too fast, and my knees told me about it, and I watched the thing come. The Calloway brothers were already out. All four of them, which almost never happened. You could go a whole season without seeing the four of them stand in one line, on account of they arranged themselves around the ranch the way you'd arrange feed so no two bulls have to look at each other. But they'd been waiting on this wagon for 11 weeks. Every one of them had put on a clean shirt. I want you to understand what a clean shirt meant in that house that year. It meant hope, and hope in the Calloway men was about as natural as a fish in a saddle. Silas stood at the front, of course, eldest, 34 and built like a fence post that's been driven too deep. You couldn't move him, but you couldn't say he looked comfortable either. Behind him, Amos, quiet, his big scarred hands hanging open at his sides the way they did when he was nervous, because Amos never learned to make a fist that wasn't for work. Then Micah, the baby of them, 22, up on the balls of his feet like a boy at a fair, and it near broke me to look at him because Micah was the one who'd written the letters. Micah still believed the letters. And off to the side, leaning on the corral rail with his weight thrown all onto his good leg, Josiah. Joss. Nobody expected Joss to be there. Joss had spent the better part of a year telling anyone who'd sit still that he was leaving Bitterwater the second the ground thawed, that he was done with cattle and cold and his brother's silences, that a man with a leg like his had no business freezing to death on a mountain when there were towns full of card tables and easier work down in the flat country. He'd said it so many times I'd started leaving a blank line in the book to write the date he actually went. He was still there, I noted that too. The wagon came to a stop the way a drunk sits down, all at once and not on purpose. The driver, a freighter named Holly's I knew a little from the Bitterwater store, half fell off the box and stood there breathing hard and not saying anything, and a freighter with nothing to say is a bad sign. He looked at Silas. He looked back at the wagon bed. He took his hat off, which is a thing a man does at a funeral. "They been sick," Holly said. "The little one's bad." I remember the exact quality of the quiet after that. It wasn't shocked quiet. The Calloways were past being shocked by anything the world did to them. It was the quiet of four men recalculating, all at once, the way you do when the river's higher than you planned and the cattle are already in it. Micah got to the wagon first. There were four of them in the bed, under a tarp gone stiff with cold, and they came up out of it slow, blinking at the flat mountain light like creatures pulled from a burrow. And I'll tell you, whatever those brothers had built in their heads over 11 weeks, whatever soft-cheeked, laughing, easy women Micah's letters had promised them, this wasn't it. These women had been through something. The eldest came up first, Ruth. I'd know her name within the hour, but I knew her the second I saw her, the way you know the lead cow. She was maybe 28 and thin in a way that hunger does and not nature, and she had a face that had decided a long time ago that crying was a luxury for people with somewhere to fall. She looked at the four brothers, and the ranch behind them, and the mountains behind that, and I watched her do the same arithmetic Silas was doing. She came up out of that wagon and put her feet on Callaway ground and squared her shoulders like she was reporting for a job she already knew she'd hate. "You'll be Silas," she said. Not a question, she'd been the one writing back. "I will." Ruth Vance, a beat. "These are my sisters." They climbed down one at a time. Delia, next in age, sharp-faced and furious-looking, though I'd come to learn that was just her face. Delia went through the whole world looking like it had shorted her on change. Then Hannah, gentle, with a voice she hadn't used yet, but you could see the softness of her, the way you can tell a horse's temper before it moves. And then they didn't hand down the fourth one. They lifted her. Cora, 17 and no bigger than a fence rail, wrapped in every coat the four of them owned, her head lolling against Ruth's shoulder, her skin the color of tallow and shining with fever. When they got her upright, her eyes came half open and rolled, and she said something none of us could hear. And Ruth said, "I know, baby, I know," in a voice that had said it 100 times on that road, and something in the yard changed. I have thought about that moment for years. Four men who'd sent away for wives, standing in a cold yard, watching a dying girl be carried toward them. Every one of them had a different thing move across his face. Micah's face fell open with plain grief, because Micah felt everything a half-second before he could think about it. Amos's hands came up, those big hands, like they already knew there was work here that was theirs. Silas's jaw went to iron. And Joss pushed off the corral rail and stood on his bad leg like it didn't hurt, which I knew for a fact it did, and he stared at that fevered girl with an expression I'd never once seen on him. Not pity, recognition. "House," Amos said, first word out of any of them in a while. "Get her in the house." They got her in the house. Now I have to tell you about the house, or none of the rest will land right. The Callaway place sat at the top of a long park in the bitter waiters, good grass, hard winters, a house their father had built with more ambition than lumber, meaning it was big and it was cold, and it had a way of echoing that a smaller house wouldn't. There'd been 7 of them in it once. Ma Callaway, a fierce little woman I only knew 2 seasons before the fever took her. A daughter, Nell, 12 years old, taken the same bad winter. And their father, Amos Sr., who lasted until the following spring and then just stopped. Sat down in the good chair one evening and didn't get up, and the doctor 2 days later called it his heart, and Silas called it grief, and I called it a man who'd looked at that empty house one time too many. 3 years, that house had been a place where 4 men ate without talking and slept without dreaming and worked, so they wouldn't have to sit in the front room where Nell's things still hung on their pegs, because nobody could stand to move them, and nobody could stand to look at them. That's the house 4 road-broken sisters walked into, a tomb with a good roof. They put Cora in the downstairs room that had been Ma and Pa Callaway's. Nobody'd slept in it since, and Ruth was giving orders before her sister's head hit the bolster. Water, hot. Broth if there was any. Vinegar, a clean cloth, more light. She moved through that dead house like she'd been running it for years, and the brothers moved to obey her the way men do when someone finally, mercifully, tells them what to do with their hands. I brought in wood. I want to be honest that I stood in the doorway of that sick room longer than I needed to, watching, because I am a nosy old man, and because something was happening in there that I hadn't seen under that roof in 3 years, which was care. Ruth wringing the cloth. Hannah, the gentle one, kneeling at the bedside and without seeming to decide to, beginning to sing. Lo, a hymn, or half of one. And Amos in the corner grinding something in a bowl, some bark or root he kept for the animals, because Amos didn't know what to do for a girl, but he knew fever, and a body is a body. Cora's breath rattled. Silas stood outside in the hall with his arms crossed, not going in, and Ruth came out at some point and found him there, and I heard the whole thing because the hall carries. You should know something, Ruth said. She kept her voice even. Before you spend one more thing on her, before you burn your wood and your broth. Say it. She's had this cough since Ohio. It isn't the road that did it. She might not, and there Ruth stopped, and I'll tell you it was the only time on that first day I heard her voice go anywhere near breaking. The doctor back home said she had a bad chest, said mountain air might help or might finish it. I wrote you she was well. I lied to you. There it is. The hall was very quiet. Why, Silas said. Because there was no work back home a woman could get that would keep four of us fed, and one of us was dying whether she came west or died in a room over a tannery in Steubenville. So I answered your advertisement and I lied. You can put us back on the wagon. Holly's hasn't left. I'll not blame you and I'll not beg. She lifted her chin. But I'll ask you to let her die warm if you're turning us out. One night. I've replayed that too. I'll not beg. From a woman who just crossed a continent with a dying sister and two others and nothing to bargain with but the truth. She wasn't begging. She was giving him the truth like a woman putting down a heavy thing she was tired of holding, and she was ready to pick it back up and carry it out the door. Silas Calloway looked at her for a long time. And then he did the thing I'd feared. Because Silas was a good man, but he was a man who'd learned that hopping got your heart broke, and planning kept your cattle alive, and he'd made a plan. We can't carry a sick girl through this winter, he said. Lo, not cruel, that was the terrible part. There was no cruelty in it, only exhaustion. We're short on hay as it is. We lost 40 head last winter. I've got 3 brothers to keep alive, and this ranch is the only thing between them and the ground. I'm sorry, genuinely, but I can't build my brothers a graveyard by taking on more grief than we can feed. He wouldn't look at the sickroom door. You can stay the night, all of you. In the morning Holly's takes you to Bitterwater and I'll pay your board there a month while you sort what's next. That's the best I've got. That's the honest best I've got. Ruth nodded once. She'd expected it. God, she'd expected it. You could see she'd expected this exact thing at every ranch and rail station between Ohio and here, and she turned to go back to her sister with her spine still straight. And Joss said no. He'd been in the doorway of the sick room the whole time, leaning on the frame, weight off his bad leg, watching. Now he came out into the hall and his limp was bad that day. The cold got into the old brake, and every step cost him, and he took them anyway. No, he said again to his eldest brother, and there was a thing in his voice I'd never heard. She stays. Joss, you want to talk about what we can carry? Joss's jaw worked. I've been dead weight on this place for 4 years. 4 years, see. Broke my leg, can't ride a full day, can't rope, can't do half what Amos does in a morning, and every one of you has looked at me across a supper table and done the arithmetic. Don't tell me you haven't. What's Joss worth? What can Joss carry? And you kept me. You never once put me on a wagon to Bitterwater and paid my board a month while I sorted what was next. His voice cracked right down the middle and he let it. So don't stand in this hall and tell that woman we can't carry her sister. We can carry what we choose to carry. We always could. We just got out of the habit of choosing. I have wrung more meaning out of that little speech over the years than out of most sermons. We got out of the habit of choosing. That was the whole house, right there. That was 3 years of grief in one sentence. Silas looked at his brother, his bitter, broken, leaving in the spring brother, who wasn't leaving, who was standing in a cold hall fighting for a stranger, and something in his iron jaw gave way about a 1/4 inch. He looked at Ruth. The mountain air, he said slowly. Your doctor said it might help her. Might, Ruth said, or finish her, he didn't promise. Nothing out here promises. Silas rubbed his face with both hands, and when he brought them down he looked 10 years older and somehow a little less like a tomb. She stays, you all stay, we'll figure the hay. He turned to go, then stopped. That's not a small thing I'm saying. You understand that if it goes bad, we'll have buried a girl we barely met. On our land and carried it, all of us. I understand better than you do, Ruth said. I've been carrying it since Ohio. Cora coughed in the next room, a wet tearing sound, and every one of us flinched. I picked up my tally book that night and I sat by the fire and I didn't know what to write. Finally I put down, wagon in, 4 sisters, 1 dying. Silas said no. Joss said no back, she stays. And then, because I'm an old fool, and because for the first time in 3 years that dead house had 4 women in it and the sound of one of them singing, I added one more line, and I'll cop to the fact that my hand wasn't steady. Something started here today. Can't tell yet if it's a mercy or a wound. Turns out it was both. It's always both, but I was ahead of the story. Let me slow down and tell you the winter. Cora didn't die that first night or the second, and by the 4th we all quietly agreed to stop expecting her to, which is a dangerous thing to agree on. That 4th morning I came in from the barn and Hannah, the gentle sister, the singer, was asleep in a chair pulled right up to the sickbed, her hand still in Cora's, both of them out cold, and Amos was building the fire back up so soft and slow so as not to wake them that a man his size had no business being that quiet. He caught me watching and colored up like I'd caught him at something and went back out to the stock without a word. That was Amos all over. He'd tend a thing tenderly and then flee the scene of it. The house changed by inches. I'd log it evenings small things because small things were the true things. Day 6, Delia reorganized the whole larder, told Micah his system was an insult to flour. Micah laughed. First I've heard him laugh since the letters. Day 9, Ruth found Nell's things on the pegs, didn't say anything to me, just stood there. Then took them down, folded them, put them in the cedar chest careful like they were her own, left the pegs empty. Silas saw the empty pegs at supper and went white and then, after a while, nodded. Nobody said a word about it. Been 3 years those pegs were full. Took a stranger one afternoon. That was the thing about the Vance women. They didn't try to fix the Callaways. They just moved through the house doing what needed doing, and the doing did the fixing. Delia's sharp tongue got Micah talking. Hannah's singing softened the front room where nobody'd sat in 3 years. Ruth ran the place with a firm hand and a fair one, and Silas, hard planning Silas, took to finding reasons to be wherever Ruth was, the 2 of them talking low over the account books, 2 people who'd carried their families on their backs so long they recognized the load in each other. It wasn't courting. It was heavier and quieter than courting. It was 2 tired people setting their burdens down side by side to see if they'd balance. Cora meanwhile fought. Lord, that girl fought. She'd rally and sit up and demand to see the horses, and then she'd sink back down burning and rattling, and Amos would grind his roots and Ruth would wring her cloths and Hannah would sing, and it'd pass and we'd breathe. Rally and sink. Rally and sink. All through December, while the snow stacked up against the north wall and the cattle bawled and the 4 brothers and I dug hay out of drifts and prayed the stack lasted, because Silas had done sums and the sums were tight and a hard January would kill us. And Joss, I have to tell you about Joss and Cora. He'd made himself her particular guardian. The man who was going to leave in the spring, who couldn't ride a full day, who'd called himself dead weight in that hall. He spent that whole winter parked in a chair by that girl's bed with a whittling knife, making her things. A horse, a bird, a little wagon with wheels that turned. She was 17 and dying and he made her toys, and I asked him once, gruff, what he thought he was doing, and he didn't look up from the wood and he said, I broke my leg, I laid up 4 months, couldn't do anything. Everybody looked at me like I was already half in the ground. You know what that does to a person, being looked at like you're already gone. He turned the little horse over in his hands. Somebody ought to make her things, ought to treat her like she's going to want things, like she's got a future to want them in. He set the horse on the windowsill in a row with the others. Nobody did that for me. I turned mean instead. She don't have to. I put my hand on his shoulder. I'm not a man who does that. He let me. Then came the bad night. It was the far end of January, the killing part of winter, and Cora crashed. Not a slow sink, a fall. She went under fast, fever like a stove lid, breath gone to a thin, wet whistle, And by midnight Ruth's steady hands weren't steady anymore, and even Amos's roots weren't touching it. And we all knew, the way you know, that we were in the last part of it. There was a doctor in Bitterwater. 2 days' ride in summer. In that snow, in that dark, with the passes drifted, I wouldn't have bet on any man making it, and I said so. Then I don't need a man who'd take the bet, Joss said, already pulling on his coat. I need one who'll go anyway. They fought about it. God, they fought. Silas grabbed him by the arm. You can't ride a full day and you know it, that leg in this cold. You'll go off the trail and freeze, and I'll have buried my brother and a stranger's sister. No, Joss, no, and Joss shook him off and looked at all of us, the whole crowded, terrified sick room, and said the thing I've never forgotten. You've all spent 4 years wondering what I'm worth, wondering what a broke-down man can carry. He was crying and not bothering to hide it, and neither was I. Let me find out. Let me finally find out. Get out of my way and let me carry something that matters. And Silas, who'd said no in that hall 2 months before, who planned, who did sums, who'd learned that hopping breaks your heart, Silas stepped out of his brother's way. Take the gray, he said, his voice ruined. She's surest on ice. And Joss, he grabbed him again, but soft this time, the two of them forehead to forehead in the doorway. You come back, whatever you find or don't. You come back to me. I'm not doing the arithmetic on you again. You hear, you're not a number, you never were. That was me being a coward. You come back. Joss went out into the dark. I'm not going to draw out the 2 days. I'll tell you plain because Ruth would want it plain. They were the longest of my life, and I have had some long ones. Cora burned. Hannah sang until her voice went. Ruth held on. And on the second night, when the fever finally broke, because it did break all on its own, her body just deciding at the last possible hour to live, we didn't cheer. We just wept, quiet, all of us, because you don't cheer when a thing that nearly killed you turns and walks away. You just breathe and shake. And thank a God you're not sure you believe in. Joss came back at dawn the 3rd day, alone. No doctor. He'd made it to the pass, and the pass was closed, drifted 20 feet, no man or horse getting through, and he'd tried until the gray went down, and he had to spend a night in a lined shack with a fire he could barely keep lit and that leg screaming. And then he'd turned around and come home with nothing, because there was nothing to bring. He came into that yard gray-faced and frostbit and empty-handed, and I watched him brace to have failed, watched a lifetime of what's Joss worth settle onto his shoulders one more time. And Cora was sitting up in the window, weak, wrung out, thin as a rail, alive, and she saw him through the glass, and she lifted one of his whittled horses off the sill and waved it at him. He fell down in the snow, just went down on his knees in the yard and put his face in his hands, and his brothers ran out and got him, all 3 of them, and I have never in my life seen 4 men hold each other like that. Micah crying, Amos silent and shaking, Silas with his brother's face in his 2 hands saying, you came back, look, she's up, and you came back. He hadn't brought the doctor, he'd brought himself. Turned out that was the thing that mattered, he just had to go find it out. That's most of the story. I'll not pretty up the parts that stayed hard. Not everybody paired off neat. Delia, sharp Delia, she and Amos circled each other all winter, and I thought sure it'd land. And come spring she sat the whole family down and said she'd come west as a bride, but she'd found she didn't want a husband. She wanted the land, the work, the horses, a life that was hers, and would they let her stay as family instead of a wife? And Amos, who I think had known before she did, just nodded and said the ranch could use a hand who saw things the way she did, and that was that. Not every love in that house was the marrying kind. Some of it was just people choosing to be each other's people. That counts. In my book, that counts double. Micah and Hannah married in May under the cottonwoods, and it was as sweet and simple as those 2, and half the singing at it was hers. Silas and Ruth took longer, 2 people that careful always do, but I logged it, the evening it turned, the 2 of them on the porch not talking, her hand finding his on the rail, neither one making a thing of it. Some falls are quiet. Those are the ones that hold. And Cora lived. The mountain air did help her, or the fighting did, or Hannah's singing, or Amos's roots, or Joss's whittled horses, or the plain stubborn refusal of everyone in that house to let one more person be taken. I don't know which, and I don't think it matters, and I've stopped trying to log the cause of a mercy. She grew up strong, that girl. Bossed us all. Rode better than any of us within 2 years, out of pure spite at having spent a winter flat on her back. Joss stayed. I never did write the date he left, in that blank line I'd saved. Come spring the ground thawed just like he'd always said it would, and he went out to the corral, and he stood there a while looking down the bitter waiter cut toward the flat country and the card tables and the easier life. And then he came back in and asked Cora did she want to learn to whittle, and she said only if he'd stop making horses that all looked the same, and he laughed, Joss, laughing. And that was the last anybody ever heard about him leaving. I closed out that year's book with a full count. Cattle come through better than Silas's grim sums had feared, on account of a mild February none of us deserved. House full. Nobody in the ground who'd been above it in the fall. But that's not the line I ended on. You know me by now. I ended on the true thing small, the way the true things come. 4 men sent away for wives because they were lonely and the house was a tomb and they'd forgotten how to choose to carry anything. What came instead was 4 women who'd been half broke by the road, one of them dying, all of them with nothing to bargain but the truth, and it turned out the 2 broken things were exactly the shape to mend each other. Nobody got saved by a stranger riding in clean. They saved each other slow, over a hard winter, by choosing to. That's the whole of it. The hope wasn't in the letters. The healing wasn't the mountain air. I wrote it down that night by the fire, last line of a full year, and my hand was steady this time.